Okay, so Mila, she's a PhD student of neuroscience at McGill University, and previously she worked at Harvard, where she developed the research she's gonna explain to us. And this work is very related to one of the pilots in Polifonia. I'm telling this because not all the people are from Polifonia. Actually, at least half of them are probably not from the Polifonia team, and which is called Child, and it's related to, as we were saying, understanding the relation between music and children, just to make it very, very general, while Mila will present a specific work in this more general area related to foreign lullabies and how, you know, the response of infants. So thanks Mila for accepting our invitation. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And please start whenever you want. You know, you have even up to 30 minutes, but you said that it probably will be short, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. Perfect.
All right, no, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to see a similar kind of corpus work and interest in infant-directed song. Yeah, looking forward to seeing what the child pilot comes up with. So yes, as mentioned, I am currently a PhD student at McGill, but the project I've been invited to talk about here, the one that's most relevant of my work to your child pilot, is this project that me and my colleagues completed at the Harvard Music Lab based in the Department of Psychology, that was published some 2 years ago now, titled Infants Relax in Response to Unfamiliar Foreign Lullabies. So this work touches upon corpus work that I hope will be interesting to you guys, as well as like the psychologist's perspective on what is happening that I hope will be enlightening. So what are psychologists doing when we study infant-directed song, or for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be using that term interchangeably with lullabies. Amongst many reasons, psychologists are very interested in lullabies because this is a form of song that crops up very consistently cross-culturally. So I don't need to explain to this audience probably that there's extremely like rich and diverse cultural musical traditions across the world. So it's really striking that even in the face of all these diversities and idiosyncrasies, that we would still be observing such a behavior that is so consistent, more so than you would expect given how much cultural exchange there is between different societies. Also, crucially, infant-directed song is a form of musical behavior where the target audience, infants, have had very little time and experience to learn the culturally specific musical landscape and to fine-tune their music perception. So what we're really interested in here is like, how is all that possible, given how much we already know about the diversity of musical ride, and given how much we know about like how much learning is often required for learning the specifics of your cultural musical landscape. Oops, sorry. So a few different questions come up here. So first of all, we have all these first impressions about what lullabies are. So we have this like, we think it's the case that lullabies pop up in all societies across the world. We kind of intuit that, oh, well, of course, there's like certain kinds of songs that everyone sings to their infants. And we intuit that, of course, infants are soothed by lullabies. But of course, if all we have is our own experience, our own culture, it's not clear whether what we experience generalizes to what humans are like and and how we got to that space. So in reaction to one of those last questions that I brought up, is it the case that infants relax in response to lullabies? A reasonable reaction you could have is, well, obviously. And so probably you have your own memories, your own experiences of a time where you had a fussy infant in your arms, and you might sing to them in a way that they soothed, that they calmed down. And we also have plenty of literature showing that infants, both typically developing infants and in clinical contexts, that music is a very powerful calming tool. So all of those things are true. I'm not doubting that you experienced what you experienced and that these studies are solid. But if the question we're really interested in is whether infants find the specific musical features of lullabies calming, it's really not as obvious as this. And the reason and the crucial confound here is the confounding role of familiarity and experience. So both in your own experiences where you remember that an infant you had in your arms calmed down in response to a lullaby, and in all of these studies, the lullabies that the kids were hearing were lullabies that they had heard dozens or hundreds of times before, like either those specific lullabies or lullabies that they hadn't heard before, but were from a very familiar musical context that shared a lot of similar musical features. And we know from a bunch of other studies that this familiarity effect is very real. We know that both in infants and adults, all else being equal, that music that is more familiar is more likely to be calming. So on the basis of like all these informations, a reasonable story to tell here is that perhaps it's not really anything to do with the musical features of lullabies that infants are finding calming, or what they're finding calming is the familiarity, and that through tons of experience, they've learned to associate certain musical features with contexts that are calming for other reasons. Like these are songs that they've heard their caregivers who they trust sing before. These are songs that they've heard in contexts where they're safe and fed and taken care of. So if the question we're interested in is, do infants find lullabies calming above and beyond how they find familiarity calming, the question we really want an answer to, that I have a huge spoiler for in my title of this talk, is whether infants find unfamiliar lullabies calming. So in order to answer those kinds of questions, so how do we set aside for a second a given infant's familiarity with the songs that they have heard their caregivers sing a bunch before? What we need is a corpus of music, both lullabies and other kinds of songs, that has lullabies and other kinds of music that the infant is very unfamiliar with. So this corpus, the natural history of song, is the corpus that colleagues of mine at my old lab built in order to answer these kinds of questions. So the goal for this corpus was to build a corpus, both a discography and an ethnography of music that, as best as we can, is representative of music from across the globe and not just one specific cultural context. That is a huge goal and can be pursued indefinitely. For the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to be referencing the first iteration of this project. It's published in 2019 in Science, led by Sam Mayer. That is comprised of these 118 song recordings from these 86 societies that I've pinpointed on this map, most of whom are like rural living, small scale societies. And in addition to some like just shy of 5,000 written records, for example, anthropologist descriptions of the musical contexts, metadata about the tracks, etc. And once we have this corpus, we can start to answer not only the final question about infants' perception of lullabies, which I'll get to, but a few of those other foundational questions we had about lullabies globally. So for example, one of the big findings that came out in attachment with this like first iteration publication of this corpus was that globally, across societies that had minimal cultural exchange, there's a lot of consistency in certain clusters of musical behaviors. So more so than you would expect, given cultural transmission, we find that all societies have some convergently come to their own form of music to dance to. Everyone has dance songs. Everyone also has songs for expressing love. All societies also have some form of song for like healing ceremonies, for healing the sick. And lastly, most interesting for today's talk, is that all societies have lullabies. So on the basis of this kind of corpus work, we can answer questions about the prevalence of lullabies worldwide. And now we know, now we have a lot of evidence for the fact that this is not a musical behavior, singing to infants, that is specific to any culture, but that humans all across the world in unrelated societies all have their own form of lullaby. Okay, so lullabies are everywhere. So meaning that adults everywhere are motivated to singing to infants. A second foundational question that we can also get to is, okay, what do those lullabies sound like? Is it actually the case that they have a lot in common, more so than you would expect given cultural transmission. And the way we can answer this is with testing whether lullabies and other categories of songs are mutually intelligible across cultures, meaning can a person from a culture A listen to a song from a culture B and accurately detect whether it's a lullaby or something else? And the way we test this is with another big cross-cultural sample of listeners listening to all those cross-cultural songs. So in this paper, Marin sang et al. 2017, what my colleagues did was we had this big sample of listeners. These are 750 listeners from 60 countries, each of whom were asked questions and could answer questionnaires like in their own native language. So experiments translated into their own native language, where they each heard some audio from the natural history of song corpus and no other information. So no information about where the song was from, no metadata about the song, just audio to see if they could detect what the function of a song is. So I have a few trials here so you can simulate what it's like to be a participant in one of these experiments. This is already more information than our participants had, but just for you. Here's a song from the Highlands of Scotland. And I'd like you to mentally, I'll play you the song in a second, and I'd like you to mentally answer the question, how likely do you think it is that this song is used to soothe the baby? You can answer it from a scale of 1 to 6, 1 being this is definitely not a song that is used to soothe the baby, to 6, this is definitely a song used to soothe the baby. So here's the example. Okay. Here's a second example. This is a song from Northwestern Canada from the Inuit. Same question. How likely do you think it is that this song is used to soothe the baby? All right, so those are two very striking examples of many in the corpus. So the two that you heard, the Highland Scottish song was in fact a love song, and this Inuit song was in fact a lullaby. So you probably had strong intuitions for those, perhaps. What did our 750 participants from 60 countries think about those songs? So here I'm going to be plotting the results from this 2017 paper. On the x-axis, I'm going to be plotting what the actual function of the song was in the society it was drawn from. So the Inuit song will be somewhere in the far right column. And on the y-axis, I'm going to be plotting participants' rating to the same question that you mentally answered. So how on average our 750 participants answer that question. Let's start by looking at all these songs that were not in fact lullabies. So when the song was in fact a dance or healing or love song, participants answered the question, do you think this song is used to soothe the baby? Like this. So I plotted a horizontal dotted line that shows the participants' average use of the scale. And what we see, is that when the song was not a lullaby, participants accurately intuited very low. Everyone cross-culturally listening to songs they'd never heard of from societies they were unfamiliar with, I'm pretty sure this is not a lullaby, correctly, on the basis of no information other than audio. When the song was in fact a lullaby, their answers looked like this. So again, on the basis of no information other than audio, no cultural exchange, participants were way above chance in their ability to correctly detect when a song is a lullaby. So a recap of two big findings so far from the building of the corpus and one follow-up experiment is that answer to some of those foundational questions, lullabies are in fact in all societies that we know of. Not only that, but they have enough features in common that make them mutually intelligible cross-culturally. Okay, so just a restatement of those findings. A few different stories could be underlying why we found what we found. So it could be, like, for example, that adults everywhere find certain kinds of musical features calming, they sing them at their infants, and infants learn to associate those musical features with being calming. Another possible story, what's happening here is that infants are predisposed to finding certain musical features calming. Adults correctly intuit those, or they like trial and error figure out what those are. And those features end up being the ones that are in lullabies across the world. So in order to disambiguate between those possibilities, we can finally get to the biggest, the most obvious puzzle piece for the story, which is the fact that lullabies are for babies, and what are babies actually perceiving in lullabies cross-culturally. Now that we have this corpus, we can test those questions. And this is the question that Connie Bainbridge and I co-led a paper on to address. So the way we address this is that now we have this natural history of song corpus, we can do an experiment very similar to the one that you just participated in. So we can take a subset of songs from the natural history of song corpus, some of them being lullabies, some of them being other kinds of songs in the societies they were drawn from, and adapt them into a listening task that's appropriate for very young children, for infants. The way we did this is that Connie built this little animated video where we had some characters, in this case, like a red guy and a blue guy, who would come up on screen, dance a little bit, and then take turns lip syncing such that they were singing each of the songs, where in this case, the red person always sang a non-lullaby, the blue person always sang a lullaby, and we can see how the infants reacted differentially to those two. We had 144 infants from the Boston area come into our lab to participate in the study, and they ranged between 2 and 14 months, and I'll get to the significance of this later. And again, because we can't ask the infants what they thought about the music in the same way that I just asked you, we gathered different kinds of data from the kids. First of all, as they were in the chair in our lab watching this video, we had a 4K camera recording them that was high enough quality such that after the fact, we were able to annotate their gaze direction on screen and duration to see what they were paying attention to for how long. It was also high enough quality that we were able to automate a pupillometry method. So we were able to detect pupil size throughout the time course of the experiment and whether or not this tracked with what kind of music they were listening to. Pupil dilation is a great indicator of both interest and like arousal levels. All of our infants were also fitted with, this is called an Empatica E4 device. This is very similar to a Fitbit in that it passively detects, this was strapped to the kid's leg, calf, or thigh. And just like a Fitbit, it like passively detects the infant's heart rate, which again is a great measure of arousal levels, and something called electrodermal activity. This is a measure of basically sweat gland activity on your skin, which even for subtle changes in your emotional arousal up or down, your electrodermal activity also goes up or down. So I have an example here as well, so you can simulate being an infant in this experiment and see what the lullabies and non-lullabies sounded like. We started with a silence trial just to familiarize the kids with the characters.
Ho ho atane, ho ho atane, ho ho atane kayo. Ay ay ya lumawani. ورد ناشلو من ناصب بدرابي فاش بالي خردا.
Etc., where each kid heard multiple pairs of songs. And in this case, as you may have intuited, the first song was in fact a lullaby. The second one was something else that I can't quite remember, but not a lullaby. All of these examples are online, by the way. If you wanted to check them out, also includes details to what cultures each song was from. So we know what adults think of all of those songs and their functions based off that 2017 study. Now we have data to see what the infants thought about them. So if it is in fact true that infants, like adults, can correctly detect a lullaby from a culture they're unfamiliar with, we should see differential reactions here. So let's start with the heart rate data. Again, on the x-axis, I'm going to be plotting what the song actually was. And on the y-axis, I'm going to be plotting the kids' mean heart rate collapsing across all trials over those different kinds of music. And what we see is this. What we see is collapsing across trials, that heart rate during the lullabies was on average lower than during the non-lullabies, consistent with them being relaxed to the lullabies, even if they've never heard them before, very unfamiliar musical style. Here's the exact same data, but plotted differently, just to show how the heart rate changed over each 14-second course of each song. What we see here is whenever a character started singing, heart rate always dropped, but that this drop was especially pronounced during the lullabies. This is important for some other developmental psychology findings. We know from previous findings that a drop in heart rate, of course, is consistent with someone being relaxed, but it is also often a marker that you're paying attention to something, especially in young infants. Whenever something novel happens on screen, for example, you observe a temporary heart rate drop, and this is sometimes indicative of not necessarily them being relaxed by something, but an attention grab. So this is why we don't stop just with the interpretation of the heart rate, and this is where I'm going to bring in our pupillometry data. The pupillometry data is especially important here because the relaxation versus attention stories about the heart rate predict different things about what we would see in our pupil data. So if it were the case that the kids were not necessarily relaxed by the lullabies, but found them more interesting, we would see more dilated, bigger pupils during the lullaby trials. If, on the other hand, they were in fact calmed by the lullabies, we would see the opposite. We would see smaller pupils during the lullaby trials. And what we find is consistent with the latter, that over the time course of any trial collapsing across trials, that pupils were significantly smaller during the lullabies. So giving a consistent story that what we're seeing is a physiological relaxation effect in response to the lullabies versus the non-lullabies. And we see convergent evidence in our electrodermal activity data. So this is a methodological note. This diagonal dotted gray line that I've plotted is an overall experimental upwards drift in electrodermal activity. If you leave a kid in a room, their parent is in the room, but in a room they've never been in before, watching a video with unfamiliar music in it, over the time course of the experiment, it will get more and more aroused because they're in a strange room. So we're interpreting our electrodermal activity trends with respect to this dotted line. And what we observe is this. So we find that relative to this drift, whenever a character came on screen that was singing a lullaby, the kids were relaxed, they showed lower electrodermal activity. And when a character came on that was singing a non-lullaby, a dance song, a healing song, a love song, this increase was exacerbated. They became even fussier at a faster rate. So we find convergent across our three physiological measures, heart rate, pupillometry, electrodermal activity, is that the lullabies elicited a relaxation effect in our kids, regardless of cultural familiarity. I mentioned we also gathered looking time, so like looking behaviors on screen. This was in case, for example, if it were true that kids were more interested in the singer of a lullaby, because that's probably a caretaker or something, relative to the singer of a non-lullaby, we may have observed that kids looked longer at the lullaby singer. And we found no such evidence for this claim. So we find that both in the both in the trials where the characters were side by side and silent, and in the trials where like one character was on screen at a time singing their own song, that we see no difference in how long the kids were attending to either of those characters. So possible on the basis of this data that while there was a consistent relaxation effect of lullabies, that this didn't translate into more social engagement as could be measured by like longer looking time in this context. Okay, so big finding, infants relax in response to unfamiliar foreign lullabies. One of the reasons we're very interested in this question is that this is a big data point for our understanding of the origins of infant-directed song. And there are two big stories that could possibly be underlying what we're seeing. One is that infant-directed song, its perception and production, is a predisposed human behavior. This story accounts for many of the findings that we're seeing. It explains the fact that infant-directed song is prevalent worldwide. It explains the fact that not only that, but they have consistent enough structural similarities that they're mutually intelligible cross-culturally. And it also explains the fact that we see such an early response, early response being significant because very young infants have had very little time to learn responses. Another possible story for the origins of infant-directed song is that this is a learned behavior. So still consistent with what we're finding is that it may be that across the world, but separately, there's some kind of convergent cultural evolution such that for reasons other than predisposition, cultures are independently getting to some form of infant-directed song that has similar features, and that infants are just super quick at learning what those are and learning to associate those with contexts that they find soothing for other reasons. In the paper that we wrote up, we brought up a few like asterisks to that interpretation. First of all, is that we have no idea how this kind of convergent cultural evolution could have happened. And second, more pertinent to us because we have data to address it, is the fact that this account would predict an age effect or a learning effect. So if it's the case that kids are just very quick at learning this, we should observe that with age in very early childhood, we should see some, as kids accumulate more experience, that they have greater reactions to the lullabies as they learn what they are. As I mentioned earlier, we had those 144 kids. We sampled them deliberately such that we had an even spread of ages. So we had an equal number of kids in like the 2 to 4 month age, for example, as the 4 to 6, as the 6 to 8, etc. So we could test whether the magnitude of this reaction changes with age. And what we find in a nutshell is that we don't find any evidence of this. So both for the heart rate effect size, so difference in heart rate between lullabies and non-lullabies, same for electrodermal activity, that the size of this reaction is very consistent across a very large age range for early childhood. So these data are not what would have been expected in a learned story about the origins of infant-directed song, but square very well for a predisposition story for the origins of infant-directed song. Yes, so that was a brief talk through of all of these results. A few big findings just from our corpus studies. First of all, that lullabies are everywhere and are cross-culturally understood. And big finding from like Connie and I's paper that on the basis of this corpus work, we can test things controlling for familiarity effect, where we find that infants are predisposed to finding these consistent features of lullabies calming. Thank you very much. Here's some of my colleagues who helped make this project possible, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mila. Very nice. Thank you so much. We can a virtual applause because this online seminar don't allow us to express a lot. That was really interesting. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm inviting the audience to just raise their hand and ask questions. Please don't be shy, and because I promised that you wouldn't have any problem in posing questions. But I have some, so maybe I can start, and then the others will follow while we wait for other questions. So I don't want to be the first, but as nobody has yet raised any hand, I can take the place. Well, I have a few questions actually. So one is very just an information. So if the corpus that you have used, the natural history song, if it's an open corpus for research purposes, I just didn't know it. And what kind of so you said that there are metadata associated with the songs.
Yes.
But there, I guess, are there the audio files or what kind of formats and type of data?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm involved in expansion of this corpus, but the 2019 published version I wasn't directly involved in, so all the details are in there. It is open access. The point is that it's available for further study. I believe it should be on like open science framework, but if you find the paper, it'll certainly be linked there. There are audio files. They are limited just because well, it's a good thing that we have to comply with like fair use and copyright law. A lot of these, well, most of these songs in that corpus are not songs that our own like anthropologist team went out and recorded, but they're existing songs. It's just that they're scattered in libraries across the world. So the work of the corpus was to build like a central repository to be able to access this globally representative collection of songs. So format-wise, there are like brief audio recordings for those 118 tracks that I mentioned. I don't have OSF in front of me, but they should be accessible. And metadata-wise, there are like annotations by multiple like expert musical raters for things like timbre and rhythm and tonality, as well as like original anthropologist liner notes, as you would expect for like liner notes of a recording.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Because actually checking whether there is any actually in fact, because I was thinking, so you were talking about similar features that lullabies have, regardless, the cultural, the provenance. So, but one thing, at least it wasn't clear from the talk, is that, so what are these features? Have you inspected those? For example, I don't know, similar melodies or harmonic structures. So do you have any evidence that there is any music feature really, that is, that goes?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I mean, on the basis of the couple of studies that I chose to include today, I mean, it must be the case that they're systematically different if people are able to detect differences. But the question of whether these are, like, for example, there's a fair question you could raise, like, oh, maybe there's cross voice differences, like the kind of people who have certain kinds of voices are more likely to sing certain kinds of songs. And this isn't really a musical difference, it's like a person voice difference. So there's a separate project that's almost published, also coming out of this lab. It's led by my colleagues, Courtney Hilton and Cody Moser. Separately to the Natural History of Song Discography, we had this study where we had our colleague anthropologists go into the field and gather, like, per individual person, please sing us an example of an adult versus an infant directed song, so we can really see, like, controlling for voice features, what the differences are. And given that corpus, you are able to really tell what the acoustic differences are between lullabies and other things. So the full details will be in that study. I think a preprint is definitely already up. Off the top of my head, there are things that satisfyingly are pretty intuitive. For example, like median pitch is something that is very distinctive cross-culturally for differentiating infant-directed song versus others. And there are some other more technical acoustical details that off the top of my head, I don't want to try and recall, but they're detailed in this Hilton and Moser paper.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, in the project, we are developing some methods for comparing different music, for example, to identify similarities in the harmonic structure or similarities in the melodic patterns and things like that. So I think it would be great to maybe try and apply this kind of methods to your corpus, to this corpus, as a follow-up, right? So probably,
Absolutely.
yeah, the study that you're talking about probably does something similar, but maybe doesn't focus on the harmonic structure or melodic structure, while this can be really interesting. I think, yeah, I think I'm gonna.
Yeah, no, that would be very cool. Especially if, sorry, I see you have a question. I'm just finished answering this one. Especially if we have slightly different, I'm sure we'll have like slightly different ways of quantifying how these things differ. So it'd be interesting to cover more ground and see, like, even with slightly different measures, whether there's a consistent structure to lullabies. Yeah.
Okay, I see a couple of hands raised now. Misael? Misael, you have your hand raised.
Yes, sorry. Oh, first of all, thank you for the very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. A question, I have two questions. So the first is, do you have data about the difference between familiar and unfamiliar lullabies? So maybe it would be interesting to see. I don't know if you already showed it.
I personally don't, but there are certainly people, like, for example, the Cerulean Tree Hub 2020, they have done a lot of work on quantifying like what this possible familiarity effect is. So I don't believe is the question you're asking, like, above and beyond this like baseline lullaby effect, what's the magnitude of like the added relaxing effect of familiarity?
Yeah.
No, that's
comparing to the non-lullaby. So what's the difference between familiar and unfamiliar, and compare it with maybe unfamiliar lullabies with non-lullabies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I don't have data for it. I would bet that you would observe that a familiar lullaby is, of course, even more soothing than an unfamiliar lullaby. But I don't have the data for like that crossed design. But yeah, would very much like to see that data.
Thank you. And the other question is about how I mean the effect, the response of the child could depend also on the visual information, on the face that is shown, or also on the order, if before the lullaby or the non-lullaby. How did you account for this, for avoiding this effect?
Yes, so
maybe
in the
randomizing.
Sorry?
No, I said maybe randomizing.
Yeah, exactly. So everything was randomized. So of the 144 kids, there were in fact 16 different conditions, where the 16 were different in that sometimes the red was the lullaby and the blue non-lullaby, sometimes vice versa. So we control that, like, it's not just red that's exciting or something. We controlled for order of the songs. We controlled for whether the voice of the singer was like a male sounding voice or a female sounding voice, everything like that. So all of that was accounted for. So when you do your final analysis, none of those things were systematically associated with anything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mila. Alessandro?
Yeah, hello, thanks for your great presentation. And I would like to continue on the path started by Valentina. Of course, it will be interesting to look at those features and identify them, because I think all of us can try to define those features, at least informally. I used some of them, I think, to rate the two songs that you proposed. And even if I didn't like the first one, I recognize the pattern of lullaby, because, you know, it's repetitive and these kind of things. And so my two quick questions are, first, have you ever thought or tried to add also sounds to these kinds of studies? I mean, sort of noises, because at least, I don't know in other countries, but in Italy, we also use repetitive and regular sounds to count babies, like, you know, an hair dryer or something like that. It often works a lot with children, and maybe there's some features it shares some features with the classical lullabies. And my other question is about the possible explanation you mentioned. You had two main, let's say, group of explanations, and you didn't mention anything, let's say, related to biology in some sense. So people often say that lullabies calm down people because children, because it's like the heartbeat of their mothers, you know, and they have
what? Sorry.
The heart rate, the heartbeat of their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if there's any biological explanation for the fact that lullabies can calm down people. So if they can be related to something that they experience even before they are born.
Okay, all right. So two questions. I'll take them in turn. First one about the inclusion of like non-song vocal noises that are perceived as soothing. Yeah, certainly a possibility. I'm sure things like white noise are soothing. Those things being true are still consistent with the story that we're telling here. So it's not a conflict to lullabies being a global phenomenon and being perceived as soothing, that other things are also perceived as soothing. Yeah, so I don't have data for like the specific example that you brought up, but yes, would be super interesting to see whether the acoustic features that make ocean noises or hair dryer or whatever soothing are also acoustic features that are included in lullabies that infants perceive to be soothing. Yeah, I don't have data for that, but yeah, super cool. I would love to see that. Second question, you said in addition to the predisposition and the learned story, there's possibly a third story where it's features of soothing music are being learned by infants, but it's not a cultural thing. It's not a predisposition. It's some kind of, they've learned like womb noises that are being replicated in lullabies. Is that the question?
Yeah, something like that. Something that has to do with, I said biology in the sense of perceiving the heartbeat of their mother or something like that, which is common to all children because, you know, that's obviously.
Yeah.
At least that's some of the explanation I've read about in the past concerning lullabies as a possibility.
I'm not sure that that's a feature that distinguishes lullabies and non-lullabies that would be perceived as calming.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We might be referring to slightly different things. I feel like I've heard this kind of heartbeat story before. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, just because I think the story I've heard is, oh, kids find the lullabies soothing because they're like matching their heart rate, so like the slower pace of lullabies. And I'm not sure what to make exactly of that, just because infants' heart rates are so high. Like biologically, infants' heart rates are very high. And like by comparison, even the non-lullabies are lower than that. So they should also find those relaxing. So I'm not sure exactly how a like heartbeat or similar story. I'm not sure exactly what other biological phenomenon we could be referring to. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what data would support or refute that claim.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mila. There is another question from the chat from Delfina. She cannot use the mic, but actually, before I will read it for you. But as she starts by saying that the evidence seems very solid, pointing towards an evolutionary predisposition. Before I continue with her question, I actually would like to ask you a clarification about that, because to me it wasn't so clear why you think you can claim that it's, you know, that there is, that your results support this claim, I mean, about the predisposition. Can you just shortly clarify for me, please?
Why these data are more in line with the predisposition story? Right. So yes.
Yeah. Well, more in line. I got this, but at the end you actually made a claim, like we discovered this. So is there a claim that you can actually? So do you think you have enough evidence because to conclude this, or do you think it's just you know the highest probability, you know,
Yeah, well, I mean, science is always going to be, you know, like iterative truth. I do think for this story, the scale is much stronger for a possible predisposition. So some theoretical background that I didn't get into today. There's a lot of theoretical background for why we would expect that certain kinds of music are good candidates for being like evolved as opposed to byproducts of something else. Again, my colleagues, I think it was 2020, very recently published in collaboration with many more like music scholars, a big theory piece that given what we know about how signals evolved, signals being like anything I could produce that you perceive, the structure of music and the way we use music very much seems like it's a credible signal of something, and one that has all the features that you would associate with like credible signaling in like evolved signals, and that lullabies are a great case study of this, exactly for all the features that I brought up, that they're more cross-culturally consistent that you could expect given cultural transmission, and that the consistent responses to them are not that well accounted for under a learning circumstance. So the much more likely explanation for what we're seeing is predisposition, and it was theoretically predicted by previous theoretical work that lullabies are an evolved credible signal.
Okay, thank you very much. So I read for you the question from Delfina. So thank you for the talk. It was incredibly interesting. The evidence seems very solid, pointing towards an evolutionary predisposition. From someone with a human evolutionary biology background, I find the idea of lullabies as an innate infant calming tool to be very interesting, and wonder about how deep, from an evolutionary sense, it might be. I was wondering if by any chance, given that other soothing behaviors are shared between humans and non-human primates too, for example, rocking, do you know if there is any research interest or taking place for extending experiments to see if lullaby-like singing to infants is a behavior that takes place also with non-human primates? Thank you again for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm just rereading. Lullaby-like singing to infants is behavior that also takes place with non-human primates. I'm not aware of any singing analogous behaviors in primates. I think both in non-human primates and in non-human animals in general, some species do have a pattern of having different kinds of signals for their infants relative to other adults. Lullaby look like vocalizations. Yeah, I mean, right. So I'm not a primate specialist. So what the theory predicts is that the ecology of human evolution was such that there was evolutionary pressure for adults to have an infant-directed signal of like investment, which is why infants find them soothing, because it's a credible signal of investment, of attentional investment. So if it's the case that non-human primates have a similar or like varying degree of that same pressure, then we might observe a similar behavior and a similar reaction in those behaviors. So that would be, if the ecology matches and the behavior also pops up, that would be a great data point to have for whether it really is that like evolutionary ecology that led to this behavior. I'm just not sure what the feature space is of non-human primate behavior is in which you can test that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, actually, we have some people from an institute where there is a group working with the primates, but I don't think there is anybody from that group here. Otherwise, it would have been very interesting. Okay. So is there any other question, comment, question? We are actually running almost out of time. But it was really great, Mila. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed those questions and the discussion. We certainly enjoyed your talk. It was great, super interesting and inspiring. And well, thanks again. So I think I think we'll be in touch. If in the project we'll get the chance to analyze this music, we'll certainly keep you in the loop. And let you know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think people from my group as well, we're interested in seeing like what the possibilities are for this kind of corpus work. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be some overlap.
Okay, so thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining us. Again, a round of applause as we did it. Yeah, see you soon, hopefully. Bye everyone.
Right, see you around.
And have a nice
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Super
Bye.
welcome. Thanks for accepting. Bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.